You're excited to move on to topic 3, same format. You'll see we'll only have one speaker this time, but we'll still have the small group and the large group discussions. And Peter Altenberger will be our moderator for this session.
Thanks, Karen. Welcome back, everybody. We're delighted to have Dr. Stephen Jernigan in today to talk about how AI could be used from more of an administrative. So we're going to keep adding to the bucket of our knowledge around AI. And this section, we're going to focus a little bit more on, I'm sure everybody here has some administrative responsibility in their roles, in their work lives. So Steve, take it away.
Thank you very much. I'll go and share my screen with everybody. All right, that should be visible to folks. Okay, so I don't know about you, but my brain is full, and I'm so thankful for the past 24 hours. I actually had to chuckle when Dr. Pusick asked AI what he should wear, and so I thought today I'll ask AI what I should wear, or actually rather, how can I be like Dr. Pusick? And AI told me wear a tie and that I still have a long ways to go. So, as much as I like AI, I did wear a tie to honor Dr. Pusick today. I'm not a tie guy, so that's that. So, anyways, our conversations, especially in the large group conversations, have been fantastic. It's prompted a lot of deep thought, a lot of really good conceptual understanding of kind of where we need to go, what we need to think about. And so this talk is going to be pulling us back a little bit to the surface to look at some how-to and some practical strategies associated with AI as it relates to administrative tasks. So I am the Associate Program Director for our program, and I'm also currently the chair of our APT committee for our school. And so you can imagine the administrative tasks that come with something like that. And so I want to share some ideas with you, but of course the why associated with all of this, which I'm not going to spend much time on because we've talked about it a lot, is what do we need more of in our days? Time, right? But we're not going to get more time. So what do we need? More efficiency. Okay, so that is one of the many whys. I heard, I think it was Kathleen earlier today mentioned minimize the mundane. I love that because it often pairs with creating more efficiency. So I do want to just kind of highlight a few things. Actually, and most of these things have been touched on at some point over across the summit. But one is to always consider privacy. As Dr. Masters said, we need to consider what it is they're doing with the data that we're putting into AI. And if we don't understand that, then to ask whether it's an open or a closed system. Explore the different AI platforms. We've heard of quite a few. I think Dr. Pusick talked about Open Evidence, the Research Rabbit, Notebook LM. Of course, there's ChatGPT, Claude, and a number of things. Look at cost and also the purpose. Effective prompts are key. We know that, right? So we're all developing our prompt skills over time. Using an iterative approach is super helpful, especially because it can learn from that iterative approach to make it more like a conversation, not just focus on like a Google search. And so beyond prompts, feed AI information. This is something I've been doing a lot more of recently, and it's been super helpful to help kind of create some guide rails or some guidelines for it to use. And then as always, you will need to review what is generated. We've talked about this a lot. We want to keep those skill sets that we have. We want to become dependent on AI. And so making sure we review what is generated. And then something I started thinking about is like, if it's not accessible, like they talk with our students in learning management systems, less clicks, the better, they'll do it more often. So I was like, well, maybe I need to do that with myself and my AI efforts. And so I pinned my browser tab to an AI platform, which allows me to then access it a lot more regularly and more easily. So just some things to consider. But what I want to spend time talking about today are what can we do from an administrative perspective using AI to kind of create that efficiency. So when I started using AI, I kind of struggled with knowing when to use it, in what circumstances would it be useful. And so what I did for this talk today is I thought about 3 different bins that we can think about as it relates to administrative efficiency. One of those bins is when we have to generate something from scratch. I promise my colleague, Dr. Morris, here at the University of Kansas Medical Center, she and I did not talk about baking, although she had the cake analogy, and I did use from scratch, but that was not intentional. So that's just happenstance. We must eat well here in the middle of Kansas. So, but anyways, generating something from scratch for me as an analytic, it feels very laborious, right? So all you have felt that before, unless you're a true creative, generating something from scratch can feel very time consuming and feels like it takes a lot of effort. And so anytime I get that gut sense of, oh, I'm going to have to generate something, this is going to be hard, then immediately that should be a trigger as to can I use AI? And so we don't want to waste time. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. And so today we're going to go through a few examples. I've bolded the ones I want to focus on, but you can definitely use AI to decrease the time that it's necessary to generate something from scratch. So that's the first bin. So as far as examples, policy generation. So I just tried, I was starting to do more formative assessments related to practical exams, and I wanted to create a policy related to these practical exams and remediation. And so I basically use this prompt, and you can see it here. If a student doesn't pass the practical exam on the first try, they can take it again, but cannot score higher than a 70%. I said, please create a policy for a syllabus about remediation of this practical exam. This is what it generated, and you'll see that it hits some really targeted areas that some of which I probably would not have considered. So for example, it hits the privacy, it hits the retake eligibility, the remediation score, what's maximum, the timing of the remediation, the preparation expectations for the student, the failure to pass on the retake and what the implications are. And then of course, the all-important academic integrity statement. While that might be true in other aspects of the syllabus or the handbook, I think it's always good to repeat that information. So again, just one quick example of when you ask it to create a policy, which is sometimes very laborious. It's not everybody's favorite thing to do. It can generate something from which you can then springboard and create additional modifications. Another example is a letter of recommendation. How many of you have written a letter of recommendation this week? I'm sure most of us will raise a hand. And so, of course, the important thing here is to really consider privacy. And so de-identify whatever it is you feed to AI to kind of generate this letter of recommendation. And so I did create a mock letter of recommendation for myself. But what I did do is I gave it the guardrails I wanted it to use, specifically the Research Foundation Scholarship. And so I linked it to a website. I said, write the letter in context of this Research Foundation, and it generated this letter. It's great. The only thing you could, there's a lot you could do with it, but once it first generates that letter, you can easily modify it by asking AI to go ahead and do something different with it. And so, for example, you could say, I want this to be half the length. I want this to be more demonstrative or more flowery in the language. I want this to be more hyperbolic, or you could say, I want this to be more scientific, and it'll modify the letter as it's needed. So I am a detail person, I'm an analytic, so I never am okay with what AI generates. But it does get me started and decreases the amount of time by at least half when I'm writing a letter of recommendation. This can also be applied to promotion letters, right? So I had to write 9 letters of promotion for our 9 reviews this cycle. And to do that would have taken a tremendous amount of time to review all the promotion documents, review the summaries, and then actually generate those letters. AI cut my time substantially. Another example is going back to some of the teaching components is syllabus and objectives, right? So in this example, I had objectives and I wanted to put it into my syllabi in a chart that would be more appropriate from a CAPTE perspective and easier to review from an accreditation perspective and so forth. And so I said, please create a table that includes the following objectives. I provided those. I said, label it with the appropriate level of Bloom's taxonomy, also relate it to the accreditation standard associated with CAPTE. I did not feed it Bloom's taxonomy. I did not feed it the CAPTE accreditation standards. Those are on the web. And so I asked it to do that and it generated a table. This is just an example of 2 of the objectives, okay? But then what I asked it to do as my second prompt was to add 2 columns to the table, including appropriate learning activities and methods for assessment and of student learning. And so quickly, my entire learning objectives with the Bloom's taxonomy, the accreditation standard, the learning activities and methods for assessment were all generated, and this within a matter of a minute or 2. So it saved me a ton of time. Now, granted, I went in, I could have fed it the specific learning activities tied to the course or the methods for assessment. I didn't, but the things it generated actually were very much on par for what I do in my course. And so again, saves me a lot of time if I had to create the table and then finding the Bloom's taxonomy associated with each of these learning objectives, but it was super helpful to minimize the time I spent doing this. So generating things can be super helpful, saves that initial effort. The other thing that I started thinking about was modifying and revising current documents. So that's the second bin. And so we all have things that we want to modify from year to year with our courses, from year to year across our service roles and so forth. And so when you do ask it to modify or revise a document, of course, you'll need to provide the document or some content, but then be very specific in what it is you want to do. Any of the things from the previous slides can be used for modifying and revising, but I'm going to show you two examples. One is emails, and then also one is a rubric. And actually, I borrowed that from Dr. Morris, which we'll talk about shortly. So for an email, I said, please write an email to faculty in a PT program about the need to include more master adaptive learning principles in our program. So I want this to really convey the importance of master adaptive learning. So that was my initial prompt, and it generated a fantastic email. It's a little bit lengthy for some of the faculty in my department. So I was like, okay, well, we need to probably shorten this. And so I did create a second prompt. And in the second prompt, I said, please modify the email to be about half the length and emphasize more the value of gathering the faculty input on this topic. That's really what I wanted, was the faculty's input, not so much a directive saying we need to do this more. And so if you look at the subject line for this email that ChatGPT generated, you can see the shift in focus, right? The top one, as you can see there, and I need to move my floating bar, is enhancing our PT curriculum with master adaptive learning principles. A little bit general, a little bit more just kind of big picture. But what the second subject was faculty input on master adaptive learning in our PT curriculum. So it really emphasized at the front what it is I wanted, which was to get input from faculty on this idea to facilitate the stages of change, right? And so I did not use this email, but it was an example of something you can do with email very easily and quickly to start generating some things more efficiently. The next thing I want to show you is a rubric. So I actually borrowed this from Dr. Scarlett Morris, who you heard from earlier today. And she uses AI a lot for teaching and learning. And so I asked her if I could use this, and she said I could. I said, create a rubric for a PT student video exam assignment using 4 parts of an exam, using SOAP style and an added reflection for learning and experience. It should be worth 40 points. She generated that rubric initially and then asked to put it into a table, and it created this rubric. Oops, sorry, went the wrong way. And you can see it's pretty robust, covers all the pieces she wanted to include. And then what she also wanted to do was to prompt it a second time. And so what she asked it to do was incorporate KSAs from this document into the rubric. And so its product soon thereafter was essentially that. And so you can see with each of the different criteria, there is a theme associated from the KSA document with that specific rubric criteria. Again, something that was done very quickly and yet was a great starting point for her to actually then modify and revise for final rubric kind of generation for the students. So again, one example of how you can take something that was created initially, so that initial rubric, and then modifying it with very specific requests. Very time efficient relative to what it might have taken otherwise if we just did that from scratch on our own. Of course, you could also link it to your course objectives if you're doing mapping of all your assessments related to your course objectives. So the third bin that I like to talk about is summarizing information. So this is kind of commonsensical. We know we can do that, but I think sometimes we forget the utility of AI for summarizing information. At the bottom of this slide, you can say, I indicate that you can also then ask it to generate recommendations based on that summary. And so I use an example of one of my course feedback, and I'm going to emphasize that and then also talk about APT guidelines. But you all know the course feedback, right? You all have that same probably experience in your gut when you ready to click the file to open up feedback on your course. Growth mindset, you're like, let's do it, let's embrace this. And if you're a little bit more of the fixed mindset, sometimes like I am on occasion, you're like, oh, I'm hesitant to open up the feedback. But the good news is, or something I've learned about myself is when you review course feedback, especially the qualitative course feedback, there are things that I perseverate on, and there are things that I kind of gloss over. We've all been there, right? And so what I really valued about using AI for summarizing the feedback, it wasn't using my bias to review the feedback. It basically was more factual in what it generated from what I fed it as it relates to the feedback. And so I was able to review the feedback a little bit more clearly and more summatively using AI, which really helped me a great deal as it relates to looking at it more holistically. And so here's an example. I actually then also prompted at the same time for it to generate recommendations. So I'm going to show you the first step, which is actually the summary of the feedback. Here's what it demonstrated. Or what it showed. It says the feedback overwhelmingly highlights the benefits of hands-on learning and practical experience in the course. It's an applied anatomy course. It's a very early on course. And so what it suggested, or actually what it summarized, was that guided practice is important. Panopto recordings are useful. Multiple instructors and open labs are useful. Interactive teaching style is helpful. Peer collaboration and practical exams. While all of these things I might have thought about in some capacity at some point, it did bring up some things that I think were really important. So the peer collaboration piece, oftentimes as teachers, we know that's important, but we don't necessarily structure our labs to focus on the peer collaboration. And so I did ask it for some suggestions, and here's what it suggested. And I really appreciated this because I am not typically an out-of-the-box thinker. I'm a very analytic within-the-box thinker. And so it definitely prompted some things to consider. So for example, the structured peer collaboration. That's something I may not have thought about. I think we all do some peer collaboration, have them work in groups and so forth. But in a very formal capacity, it's something I wanted to think about more. It talked about bringing those interactive learning tools like PhysioU that we use in our program into the classroom a little bit more robustly, so there's not as much discrepancy or perhaps some confusion around which source do we use? Do we use what you taught? Do we use PhysioU? And so it had some really good suggestions for me to consider. We actually took this idea of structured peer collaboration and have transferred it to another course, the cardiopulmonary course. And one of our instructors has had so much fun, and the students have really taken to it, where they're actually facilitating checking off students related to formative approaches to techniques in the cardiopulmonary course. And the students are just loving it. They've created an index card system where they get stars if they're starting to help their peers. I mean, they've just really run with it. And so again, some of these ideas that I would never have thought of, but AI has been helpful to kind of prompt some of these ideas. As far as APT guidelines, again, I wanted to see what other R1 institutions are using for their APT guidelines for modified track titles. And so instead of searching through 25 different institutions' guidelines on their websites, I asked AI to generate some content. And so a vast amount of information that would have taken me hours and hours to review, it summarized it for me in a substantial way, and it was super helpful. I then consolidated that to just what happens in the Midwest area for R1 institutions. And then I could then cross-check a lot of this information by doing some spot checking. I could even ask it for specific institutions that I want to look at comparators for our institution, and so there's a lot of ways that we can use AI to really essentially create more efficiency for us. This saved me a lot of time and actually generated a lot of informative discussion for our committee related to APT in our school. So how do we use AI effectively with tasks? We need to use effective prompts. There's a LinkedIn resource there to using effective prompts. I know you all have probably a lot of sources of information for that, but using iterative prompts. So again, the iterative piece is super important, is one of the benefits of AI versus just using Google. And so definitely use that to your advantage. Using existing data and using it as input for your asks, like I showed some examples of, is super helpful, but watch out for the rabbit hole, right? So we can all, and not research rabbit, but the rabbit hole, which is where we start using AI, and then we can spend hours just playing with it because it's so much fun. But that kind of goes against why we're using AI, at least my why right now, which is efficiency. So be aware that there is a time where we need to cut it off. We can set limits. I'm sure we can ask AI to set our limit for the session if we needed to for time, but that's something to consider. But you can also ask AI to help you create prompts. And so I'm going to show you a quick example of that. So my prompt was, I have a problem. I spend too much time reviewing program evaluations and need a quicker way to review the information. Pull out the common issues and then develop strategies to improve upon these issues. Can you help me create a prompt? You can see the prompt that ChatGPT created, which was, please analyze the following program evaluation data, identify the most common issues, categorize them by theme, and summarize the key takeaways. Then suggest specific strategies for addressing these issues to improve the program. If you want a more structured response, you can add these details. So it gave me some really informative things to use for my prompt. And so I gave it feedback. I said, this is helpful. Thank you very much, friend. What are some other details I could add to my prompt beyond those already suggested? And you can see here that they really suggest some valuable things to consider. So for example, the trends over time. If I have multiple years of data, can it start to show me that? Thinking about the stakeholder breakdown, I want student lens, faculty lens, and the external reviewers lens. What is the supportive data? So again, things I might not have thought about as the director of outcomes, it becomes super helpful to prompt deeper thought and allows me to get there a whole lot more quickly. So in summary, what I talked about today is 3 bins that we can think about as it relates to our administrative tasks. When I want to generate something from scratch, think about AI. When I want to modify or revise existing documents, think about AI. And when I want to summarize information, especially a large amount of information, AI can definitely be used to help, and then ask it to generate some recommendations. So that is all I had to present. I think I'm really close to that 20 minutes. But the small group discussion questions are, where do you find yourself spending more time than you want to with your current workflow and administrative tasks? That's a question I've asked of myself to think about how I can start using AI. Where do you want more efficiency? And then the second one is really, how can you use AI to streamline those tasks? And I think a lot of you are probably already using AI and probably have a great ideas that are not necessarily ones I've covered. And so I would love for you all to share those ideas as well. So with that, I'll pass the baton.